This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. Building roads and power plants in Afghanistan has been a key part of the U.S. strategy to defeat the Taliban. But a government watchdog agency says that instead of helping to build support among Afghans, the focus on infrastructure may be hurting counterinsurgency efforts. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction says that when overambitious construction projects fail, they create an expectations gap that loses the support of locals. Are reconstruction projects in Afghanistan doing more harm than good? I'll ask my guest, Brian Bennett, national security correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. Welcome. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
Happy to be here.
So what's the idea? What's the theory behind building roads and bridges and water projects and power plants as part of a counterinsurgency strategy?
So this multi-million-dollar fund was created to help out the counterinsurgency strategy as part of not just going after the enemy in military operations, but also trying to build goodwill among the population to get the cooperation of the population by building out electrical grids, building needed schools, building infrastructure projects like roads, a lot of things that Afghanistan was in short supply of. And the thought was, hey, let's try to get some of these big, major infrastructure projects accomplished, and then generate some goodwill in the community and try to get the cooperation of the local population.
Now, there's been lots of infrastructure projects going on ever since the U.S. came into Afghanistan a decade ago. Some $90 billion spent. What is there to show for it?
Well, I mean, there is some to show for. There have been some things accomplished. There's been a major road completed between Pakistan, the Jalalabad road, and Kabul. But what the study showed was that one fund, a fund of $400 million, that was specifically focused on helping the counterinsurgency effort, mostly in the south, southwest, and eastern part of the country, that these projects, the majority of these projects were way behind schedule, over 6 months to over a year behind schedule, and that they had, in fact, generated frustration in the community rather than goodwill. So you had a situation where the U.S. came in, said, hey, we're going to build a road here, or we're going to put down some electrical lines, and 6 months later, when the project's supposed to be finished, it's not completed, and it's created the exact opposite result than the Americans were intending.
And part of the criticism from the Inspector General was not just that there's frustration and it comes from government projects dragging on in any case, but that the delays were going to mean that a lot of these projects aren't going to be finished until after NATO forces leave in 2014 anyway, which suggests that as a counterinsurgency strategy, it really can't be much part of the counterinsurgency.
Well, this is one of the amazing things about this report, was that it showed that a number of the projects underway aren't going to be completed by 2014, which is when NATO is supposed to draw down the majority of its combat troops. And the idea that you've sunk a bunch of money into these projects that were supposed to help out your soldiers on the ground and their counterinsurgency strategy, is supposed to help ferret out the Taliban by generating goodwill within the community, the idea that these projects won't even be completed by the time most of the combat soldiers are out, I mean, that just speaks to a lot of the dysfunction that went on here. And it's interesting to look at the report and see it's not just security issues that were a problem. I mean, some of these projects were plagued with attacks and security issues, but the report also says that there were just bureaucratic problems inside the way the U.S. government administered these projects. There were delays in funding, for example. Because
you have various entities within the U.S. government that are having to cooperate or perhaps not cooperate that much in the spending of the money. It's not just the Department of Defense or the State Department, but rather the State Department and the Department of Defense working together, or perhaps not working together, in figuring out who's got the money, who's going to spend the money.
That's exactly right. And I mean, the report found that just moving the money into the needed bank accounts in order to get the projects completed had led to some of the delays. And these are avoidable delays.
Now, what happens when the infrastructure does get built? If you've got it public that this is all part of a counterinsurgency strategy, that your whole goal is to have this infrastructure to make life better for the public so that they are favorably disposed toward the NATO enterprise and the Afghan government, doesn't that paint a big target on this infrastructure for the Taliban, which wants to oppose that?
Well, I think that's an interesting argument. You have these projects that are going out, they're being advertised as being built by the American people, for example, for the Afghan people. And I would think, yes, it does make it a target. I think does that mean you shouldn't spend the money? Probably not. You probably should try to do some of these projects, but make sure you get them accomplished when you say they're going to get them accomplished. Otherwise, the whole reason for doing it, generating goodwill, it goes out the window. And maybe set your sights a little lower. Instead of trying to build a huge road network, maybe just pick a few key things, projects that can get accomplished. And this report suggested, that should be done, and that some of these projects were just too ambitious.
One of the things about the ambitions of the projects, even the ones that aren't tremendously ambitious, the complexity and unanticipated problems still seem to be derailing a number of these projects. So, for example, the Inspector General was talking about police stations, forward police stations that had been built, but then are not being used or not being occupied by Afghan police forces because things were missing, such as water supply. And so you build a police station out in the desert, but if there's no water supply, it can't be used.
Yeah, there were big problems with planning and also with execution. And this is what the report found out, was a lot of the times the money would go out, the project would be built, but it wasn't supervised well enough to make sure that all the things like a water supply were in place to make sure that this police station or other things could be used.
Now, part of the problem the Inspector General is identifying is also that if the Afghan government is not involved, or perhaps involved in a way that suggests to the public that there's corruption going on, that it ends up not building support for the Afghan government. Were there recommendations in the report about how to better involve the Afghans themselves in these projects?
Well, the feeling was that it needed to be much better conceived from the beginning to make sure that the people in the neighborhood or the town that the project is trying to benefit feel like they're a part of it, that the money isn't just going to a favorite of the government, and that the money is actually going into the community.
One of the other problems identified was the long-term viability of some of these projects. So, for example, with turbines being hydroelectric power turbines being put in, a problem of even when the project is done, how will it be maintained? Something that is even a problem with something as simple as roads, whether the government's going to be in a position to keep the roads clear and potholes repaired, let alone being able to keep a hydroelectric power plant running.
That's exactly right. So Afghanistan has a shortage of engineers. There's a shortage of road crews, as you can imagine. And so when you build these big infrastructure projects, not only is there the cost of just getting it done and building it, but you have this long tail cost that goes out into the future to maintain them, to fix the potholes in the roads, make sure that traffic can keep going on them, and to maintain complex industrial plants requires a steady stream of money. And right now, Afghanistan's budget is almost entirely dependent on international aid, and they don't have the budget line items to continue the maintenance on a lot of these projects.
Is there an expectation that that maintenance will be forthcoming, the money for that maintenance will be forthcoming once the NATO forces have largely left?
This is the big question mark, is what's going to happen to the international aid once the NATO forces, majority of NATO forces pull out in 2014. Is there going to be money still coming into the country? And all these nations, especially in Europe, that have been, and the U.S. have been contributing, are facing hard financial times right now. And I think there's a question mark as to whether or not and how much the aid money is going to keep coming into Afghanistan.
Now, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul responded to the Inspector General report saying, quote, "These critical infrastructure projects have signaled to Afghan populations the U.S. government's long-term commitment to Afghanistan." Do you think there's a sense in Afghanistan that the U.S. has a long-term commitment that it's going to follow through on?
Well, the U.S. has been there for almost a decade now, so that it's one of the longest military engagements the U.S. has ever been involved in. So in one sense, that has been a long-term commitment. But I do agree that there's this feeling among the average Afghan people that eventually the U.S. is going to leave. Like many empires and nations before that have come into Afghanistan, they always leave, whether it's Britain or Russia or the U.S.
Well, Brian Bennett is national security correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.